This is the third lecture in the series on the Empire Strikes Back against Paraguay. Um, and you'll recall that last time we had stopped with Cordell Hull bringing Jose Felix Estigarribia to Washington. Now, I'm just going to add a personal note here because at this time, 1939 and 1940, it was U.S. Army military intelligence which provided whatever intelligence it could and was required by the President and, of course, his Secretary of State and others in his cabinet. This was because the CIA didn't yet exist, nor did the OSS. So I happened to go through intelligence school in January or February of 1960, which was 15 years after the end of the war, and well after the CIA had been given the assignment to handle Paraguay and the rest of South America by the Truman Gang, who had set up the CIA specifically to deal with problems of subversion that they wanted to create around the world, but especially in Latin America. So when I went to intelligence school, we were still getting lectures from people who had actually been there, and getting, that is in Paraguay, for example, and had been involved in all of this sort of thing. So to me, it's been kind of like writing this chapter was kind of like going back over some of my old history, and I thought I'd just mention that as we get started because it'll give you some reason to understand how some of the reconstructions I talk about here are not just matters that you can pick up out of research documents that have been published in more recent years, but are things that I actually remember. Now, Cordell Hull was not the kind of Secretary of State who would let any nonsense go on his watch. And he knew all about the Nazi, fascist, Spanish, and of course the Italian operations that were going on all over South America because the military intelligence had kept him informed. So he brings this guy, Jose Felix Estigarribia, to Washington, D.C., and he just tells him, look, this is the deal. Now, we know you because you've been on our payroll for a long time. And we know that you know that it's in your interest to do the right thing, which, of course, to him means provide him to do exactly what he tells him to do. So he says, we're going to send you back down there with the cash you need in hand that's coming out of our Export-Import Treaty, and which will be about $3.5 million, which should be plenty of money to get people in line for the moment, but if you need more, there'll be more coming. And the U.S. ambassador down there is a friend of mine, and he is going to stay in close contact with you and be sure that you have all of the resources that we can provide, including, if you need it, we'll send some killers down there because we have them, and they know how to handle things like this, and it might help you keep your own people out of trouble. And because in those days it were the military intelligence guys like me who they would send to do this kind of work. Now, one of the reasons why this still goes on to a certain degree, or at least did in 1960 in places like Paraguay, is that the CIA was swamped with postal inspector rejects, which they had brought on themselves, primarily because they had to beef up, they had to muscle up, and they were taking just about anybody that they could get past a minimal security clearance. And so they had been dragging the bottom of the barrel, and even so they didn't have the kind of people that they really needed, because a postal inspector reject is about the lowest form of law enforcement in the United States at that time, and it's not really the kind of guy, this is no James Bond, let me put it that way. So at any rate, this was the situation that confronted Cordell Hull in Paraguay. He knew this place was full of Nazis, Mussolini sympathizers, Franco fascists of one kind or another, and this is what he wanted to stop. Now, he and Roosevelt had decided we're going to have to get rid of all of these guys in South America because there's a shitload of them that have been coming over there from Germany and Italy and France, Spain, and you know what we need to do. what they decided to do was just kill everyone they could get their hands on. So they needed to send guys like me, for example, to South America that would get these jobs done. So that's where some of the insight for this particular chapter that I'm writing comes from. And the rest, of course, comes from historical records. Now, Garibia did exactly what he was told to do, and from then on, whatever the U.S. ambassador told him to do, he did it. So accordingly, he began a land reform that promised this small plot of land to every Paraguayan family, trying to build up some kind of popular support for an otherwise unpopular government. He reopened the university, and he implemented monetary and municipal reforms, balanced the budget, financed the public debt, increased the capital of the Central Bank of Paraguay, and drew up plans to build highways and public works. All of this financed with loans from the U.S. and watched over carefully so that it didn't get stolen like it does nowadays, where Washington doesn't care. They'll just send an airplane full of shrink-wrapped $100 bills to places like Iraq or Afghanistan. They know that the guys, or the Ukraine, they know these thugs are going to be waiting for the planes right on the airstrip, and they're going to grab as much of that money as they can and ship it straight to their bank accounts in Switzerland. But in these days, 1939, 1940, this is not what Washington wanted. They wanted the money that they were providing to be used exactly as they wanted it to be used. So he did face, that is, Estigarribia did face sharp criticism from the conservative Catholic intellectuals in Paraguay, because the Vatican was still aligned with fascists in Italy and Spain, and of course with Hitler. Now, needless to say, their Paraguayan latifundista clients hated Estigarribia and Gringolandia in about equal amounts, and the U.S. was far too left for them. So the official Catholic Church newspaper El Tiempo took the point in terms of propaganda, and anti-Estigarribia Februarista student activists from the university joined them. Anti-government demonstrations broke out in Asunción, and the army suppressed them rather quickly and arrested Catholic and Februarista leaders, and this led to withdrawal of the Colorado Party support for Estigarribia and an attempted coup against him on February 14th, 1940, that broke out in Campo Grande military base. Now, as you can see, we still have all of 1940 virtually to go through in 1941 before the U.S. gets into the war, but that gives just a little less than 2 years for FDR and Cordell Hull to get these South American clowns in line. And the Gringo Alliance did prove to be irreversible, and on that same day the U.S. ambassador told Estigarribia, quote, "I don't have time for this," unquote. And he instructed Estigarribia to establish a temporary dictatorship, which he did 4 days later on February 18th, 1940. Now, he created a new constitution, the one of 1940, which empowered a new executive which was capable of dealing with subversion. It served to legitimize, Abraham Lincoln style, the presidential leadership as it was needed, and the Second World War was barely 2 years away, and Cordell Hull wanted an allied Paraguay, and he got it. The first task was for them to deal with their native fascists, as I pointed out, and with this constitution he got an adequately powered executive and a unicameral parliament. A one-house parliament is a lot easier to control than a two-house parliament for what should be obvious reasons. The military was politically charged with safeguarding the Gringoized government, and that gave it a political role officially for the first time. Then Estigarribia's airplane crashed under mysterious circumstances. He was killed, and a man named Eugenio Moranigo took the reins. And he was president from 1940 to 1948 and had begun as war minister. And he proved to be a shrewd politician, and he now inherited Estigarribia's powers provided by the 1940 Constitution. And on September 30th of that year, after growing disagreements with Moranigo, the Liberal Party ministers resigned from the government. And on October 16th, he announced that the presidential elections were postponed for 2 years, and anyone who didn't like it would be subject to confinement. All of this, of course, under the orders of the U.S. ambassador. Now, he then announced that all political parties were banned, and he established a military dictatorship. This coup changed very little because the powers of the executive had already been established by Estigarribia in his 1940 Constitution. And since the Gringos wrote it, they saw no need to object to it. And on April 17, 1941, he suppressed a Februarista uprising. On April 25th of 1942, he banned all of the Liberal Party, accusing them of conspiring with Bolivians and exiled liberal leaders. During his dictatorship, Morinigo faced widespread resistance, including Trotskyite strikes and military revolts. He survived because most of the unions were under the leadership of the Communist Party, and its wartime unity government policy was to support the government of this guy, and he had the loyalty of the Paraguayan army. He used, in actuality, the right-wing Colorado faction, Red Banner, led by Juan Natolico Gonzalez, as a paramilitary police force to intimidate recalcitrant Februaristas and liberals, and when necessary, U.S. Army military intelligence agents came in and backed them up and did the job. He shut down newspapers for all of the opposition, Februaristas and liberals in particular, and the publishers ran for it, got out of the country, and stayed in exile. In the rigged presidential elections of February 15, 1943, he won, but he was the only candidate, and he lasted until 1948. Now, as in other South American countries, the local ruling classes were very pro-Nazi and pro-fascist, and especially its military officers. So the U.S. had seen to it, as we have seen, that Paraguay was sufficiently neutered. But in February 45, seeing that the jig was up in Europe, Paraguay's ruling classes agreed to declare war on Germany. And the same thing happened in Argentina and Brazil, for that matter. But Argentina's pro-Axis leanings under the 1943 United Officers government alarmed the U.S. This is the one where Colonel Perón comes in as a lower-ranking officer within the junta, and by the time he's done, he's running the junta. Its ambassador in Asunción was careful to keep Paraguay away from German and Argentine influence, and at the same time the U.S. sought to enhance its presence in the region and pursued close cooperation with Brazil, which was Argentina's traditional rivalry, and we've discussed that many times. Accordingly, Gringolandia provided Paraguay sizable amounts of cash and military supplies under the Lend-Lease agreement originally, and eventually this assistance extended to provide loans for public works, technical assistance in agriculture, and even health care. So the State Department insisted on close relations between Brazil and Paraguay, rather than Paraguay with Argentina, and so that's what happened. Now, Paraguayan officials believed their interest lay in economic expediency. Morinigo refused to act against German economic and diplomatic interests until the very end of the war. German agents had successfully converted many Paraguayans to the Nazi cause. In fact, South America's first Nazi Party branch had been founded in Paraguay in 1931. But now Washington was going to swing to the right. And in Paraguay, what that meant was, we're going to see, German immigrant schools, churches, hospitals, farmers' cooperatives, youth groups, and charitable societies had become active Axis backers of the 1930s. Now, all of those organizations prominently displayed swastikas and portraits of Adolf Hitler. Now, after the Truman Gang kicked off the Cold War preparations for World War III against the USSR and reactivated Nazis worldwide wherever possible, Paraguay was quite ready to take the point. The arrival of the CIA in force in 1948 enabled the transfer of political power into the hands of those most reactionary elements in Paraguayan society. But I can tell you that from practice, the truth is that the embassy was swamped with the arrival of these CIA guys, but they really weren't up to the task. And so according to our instructors at Fort Holabird when I was there in January, February, and March of 1960, military intelligence was still being called to do a job that these guys didn't know how to do, weren't up to, or didn't want to do, or whatever it might be. Now, the Communist Party and the Februaristas made common cause with the Liberal Party in the Civil War of 1947. So as the U.S. turned right, Stalin began to move his forces into this whole thing, and on March 7th, a bloody civil war started, soon led by Rafael Franco, With the help of Colorado Party militants and Argentinian President Juan Perón, Morenigo managed to win, but at a high cost, including 300,000 refugees who fled to Argentina. Alfredo Stroessner remained loyal to Morenigo during the Civil War. He was a lieutenant colonel at the time. Now, after the war, the Truman administration took a while. It was coming up with its new program for a fascist Latin America, and this required the creation of a shock force for fascism. But in 1946, it was being created in the form of the CIA, had not yet actually solidified. In the meantime, the U.S. Embassy was floundering around, having been staffed with new dealers, having one face, and now Janus-like, the embassy was looking in its opposite direction with the incoming Trumanite fascists. So the U.S. Embassy was waiting for new instructions and a new ambassador, and as a result, Paraguay was momentarily allowed to follow whatever wishes it might have. Now, the key thing here is the rise of Alfredo Stroessner. As we've seen, the coup d'etat in December of 46 evolved into a full-scale civil war in March of 47. Rafael Franco led the rebel coalitions of Februaristas, liberals, and communists, united only in their desire to overthrow Morenigo. Hating Franco, the Colorados helped Morenigo crush the insurgency. Their leaders were General Bruguets, commander of their artillery regiment, and Lieutenant Colonel Alfredo Stroessner. The revolt at the Asuncion Navy Yard put a strategic working-class neighborhood into rebel hands, and Stroessner's regiment was sent to suppress it, which it did by reducing the workers' homes to rubble. When rebel gunboats threatened to dash upriver from Argentina to bombard the capital into submission, Stroessner's forces destroyed them. And toward the end of the rebellion, the U.S. had finished forming the CIA. Thus, in August of 48, the CIA formally took charge of events in Paraguay and the Colorado Party, and the CIA promptly adopted a policy of simplifying politics by eliminating all other parties. Since 90% of the officer corps joined the rebels, the Army in turn had to be reorganized, and so it was reduced in size, and incoming gringo CIA agents vetted new Paraguayan Army officers. The CIA chose Gonzales and his Guion Rojo paramilitary to intimidate the Democraticos and gain his party's presidential nomination, and then he ran unopposed in the 1948 elections. And to ensure a smooth transfer, a group of CIA hand-picked Colorado military officers led by Alfredo Stroessner arrested Morenigo on June 30th, 1948, and booted him unceremoniously out of the country. After a short presidency, Gonzales joined Morenigo in exile. Why? Because the CIA had picked the better man, and he had turned out to be top cop Federico Chavez. Chavez assumed the presidency on September 10th of 49. However, the CIA felt the need for the emergence of a truly competent man and settled instead on Alfredo Stroessner. On May 4th, 1954, Stroessner ordered his troops into action, and against the government of Federico Chavez, fierce resistance by the top cop's police left over 50 dead cops. And Stroessner was going to run Paraguay for the CIA until his death in 1989. Brazil's financing of the U.S. $19 billion, that's what it cost, $19 billion US dollars, Itaipu Dam on the Rio Paraná between Paraguay and Brazil had far-reaching consequences for Paraguay. Brazil paid the cash bill, and Paraguay made concessions regarding ownership of the construction site, and as importantly, Paraguay agreed to sell its share of the electricity at a rate perfect for Brazil, and all of this made good sense in terms of long-term financial planning, as Itaipu gave Paraguay's economy a new source of wealth. The construction produced a tremendous economic boom as thousands of Paraguayans who had never before held regular jobs were proletarianized. They went to work on the enormous dam for long periods of time, and this gave the Communist Party a new long-term base, even though it was still underground. However, the international communist movement was undergoing schism because of modern revisionism in the USSR, and Paraguay was not immune. So in 1967 the party split, and the pro-China wing formed, calling itself the Paraguayan Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, PCP-ML. From 1973, when construction began, until 1982, when it ended, gross domestic product in Paraguay grew more than 8% a year. That was double the rate for the previous decade and higher than growth rates in most other Latin American countries at that time. Foreign exchange earnings from electricity sales to Brazil soared, and the newly employed Paraguayan workforce stimulated domestic demand, bringing about a rapid expansion in the agricultural sector, as most workers were still tied to their farms at home, and so they would take their money from their day jobs whenever they had the time and go back and work on their family farm. And of course, if and when the employment finally ended for each and every one of them, they would have a nice farm to go back and sit down with a pretty good little store of cash. On February 3rd of '89, Stroessner was overthrown in a military coup headed by his close associate, General Andrés Rodriguez, and he went into exile in Brazil, where he died in 2006. At the time of his death, Stroessner was a criminal defendant in Paraguay. The CIA had been ordered to dump him, and in his place they chose General Andrés Rodriguez to institute political, legal, and economic changes. Changes more in line with the new neoliberal agenda. He was ordered to begin rapprochement with the international community, and he did, and in the municipal elections of 1991, opposition candidates were actually allowed to win. And they did win in several major urban centers, including Asunción. The June 1992 Constitution established a bourgeois democratic system of government. In May '93, the Colorado Party leader was Juan Carlos Wasmosy, and he was elected president as their candidate in what gringo observers deemed fair and free elections, with support from the U.S., the Organization of American States, and other countries in the region. The Paraguayan people rejected an April 1996 attempt by then Army Chief General Lino Oviedo to oust President Wasmosy. In the 1998 election, Oviedo became the Colorado candidate for president, but when the U.S. ambassador objected, the Supreme Court of Paraguay upheld Oviedo's April conviction on charges related to the '96 coup attempt, so he was not allowed to run and remained in confinement, and his former running mate, Raul Cubas, became the Colorado Party's candidate, and he was accordingly elected in May in elections deemed by gringo observers to be free and fair. One of Cubas's first acts after taking office in August was to commute Oviedo's sentence and release him from confinement. And the gringo embassy wanted a Nixon-style pardon for him. In December '98, Paraguay's Supreme Court declared these actions unconstitutional, and after delaying for 2 months, Cubas openly defied the Supreme Court in February '99, refusing to return Oviedo to jail. In this tense atmosphere, the murder of Vice President and longtime Oviedo rival Luis Maria Agaña on March 23rd of '99 led the Chamber of Deputies to impeach Cubas the next day, and this effectively put an end to the campaign of the U.S. ambassador for a Nixon-style pardon to end the matter. In March 26th, murder of 8 students occurred who were anti-government demonstrators in the Paraguay March incident that had been carried out by Oviedo supporters. And this made it clear that the Senate would vote to remove Cubas on March 29th. So the U.S. ambassador told Cubas to resign, and he was sworn in as president that day. Cubas left for Brazil the next day, where he received asylum, and Oviedo fled the same day, first to Argentina, then to Brazil. And in December of 2001, Brazil rejected Paraguay's petition to extradite Oviedo to stand trial for the March '99 assassination and the Março Paraguayo incident. González Macri was instructed to create a coalition government. He did his bid. The Liberal Party pulled out of the government in February 2000, and even so, the González Macri government achieved a consensus among the parties on many controversial issues. Liberal Party leader Julio César Franco won the August 2000 election to fill a vacant vice presidential position, and in 2003, Niconar Duarte Frutos was elected president. And August 1st, 2004, arsonists burned a supermarket in Asunción, killing nearly 400 people and injuring hundreds more, and public anger began to spiral upward. Another unwanted imperialist outpost. In July 1st of 2005, the U.S. reportedly deployed troops and aircraft to the large military airfield of Mariscal Estigarribia as part of a bid to extend control of strategic interests in the Latin American sphere, particularly in Bolivia. Now, naturally, this triggered anger that is even more public, and the Gringo regime demanded that its military training agreement with Asuncion give immunity to U.S. soldiers for any crimes they might commit. Since the U.S. planned a base housing 20,000 U.S. soldiers who would always be in trouble, judging by their behavior elsewhere, this pissed off the entire region, and the Gringo Air Base at Mariscal Estigarribia would be within 150 miles of Argentina and Bolivia and 180 miles from Brazil, so they weren't happy about it. And the kicker is that his U.S. airport received large planes, the B-52, the C-130 Hercules, which the Paraguayan Air Forces did not even have and did not need and did not want. So the entire matter was one of great concern, and the issue was in doubt. Trying to get out of the kitchen heat, the governments of Paraguay and the U.S. subsequently declared that the use of Luis Maria Argaña International Airport was the only point of transfer for a very few soldiers in Paraguay at any given time. But of course that did not assuage opinion concerning the Mariscal Estigarribia Air Base once it would be completed. The fascist Clarín, C-L-A-R-I-N, Argentinian newspaper with the biggest circulation in South America, tried to come to the Gringos' rescue. Clarín declared that the U.S. military base was strategic to the anti-communist global chess game because of its location near Tres Fronteras, three frontiers. That is the area between Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. Tres Fronteras is close to the Guarani Aquifer, which is of strategic importance to all three countries. And the Gringo plan to control all of the water as it can, all of the globe's water that is it can, was bad enough. However, even more dangerous is that this area is close to Bolivia, only a little over 100 miles away, and since Washington's Altiplano plan is to overthrow Morales in Bolivia and then Maduro in Venezuela from the east, while taking over Peru as it has in the west, and is well known, Clarin's feeble attempts to rescue the Gringo plan failed. For the 2008 general elections, the Colorado Party was once again a favorite. However, this time, the candidate was not an internal opponent to the president and self-proclaimed reformer, as in the two previous elections, but Minister of Education Blanca Ovelar, a Paraguayan Hillary Clinton. She is the first woman to appear as a candidate for a major party in Paraguayan history. Now, PCP, that is the Communist Party of Paraguay, was a founding member of the United Left, IU are the initials, for Izquierda Unida, in 2002, but later it withdrew in 2003. A part of the PCP, however, called the Movimiento por la Recuperación Democrático del Partido Comunista Paraguay, the movement for the democratic recovery of the Communist Party of Paraguay, chose to continue to work with the IU. Differences over electoral strategy and candidates were responsible for this split. And during the 2008 election, the PCP favored Fernando Lugo, the candidate of the Patriotic Alliance for Change, and Lugo won the election. Today, the PCP publishes Adelante, that is, forward. After 6 years of one-party rule by the Colorados, the voters this time chose a non-politician, former Roman Catholic Bishop Fernando Lugo. Lugo was, a long-time, liberation theologian, the kind of guy that the Catholic Church, the Vatican Holy Office, actually really hates. So, on 20th of April 2008, Lugo won the election by a margin of 10%, gaining a 42.3% vote share. The Colorado Party candidate, Blanca Ovelar, acknowledged that Lugo had an unassailable lead, and she conceded the race that same night at about 9 o'clock local time. 2 hours later, President Duarte acknowledged that the Colorados had lost an election. The country, for the first time in their history, the country had gained independence in 1811, and that a ruling party had peacefully surrendered power to an elected member from the opposition. He became Paraguay's second leftist president, that is Lugo, the first being Rafael Franco, who served from 1936 to 37. Lugo was sworn in accordingly as president on 15 August 2008, saying he would not accept the presidential salary because, quote, it belongs to more humble people, unquote, and encouraged other politicians to refuse their salaries as well. On 18 August 2008, Lugo named Margarita Mbiwangi, a member of the Ake indigenous ethnic group, as Secretary of Indigenous Affairs, and she was the first indigenous person to hold such a position in Paraguay. Two of the main promises of Lugo's presidential campaign were tackling corruption and encouraging land reform. A number of initiatives were introduced to improve the lives of Paraguay's poor, such as investments in low-income housing, the introduction of free treatment in public hospitals, and the introduction of cash transfers for Paraguay's most impoverished citizens. On the 15th of June of 2012, 17 people were murdered in a clash between landless farmers and the police, who were trying to evict them, and this was taken as a pretext by the ruling class to expel Lugo. The Chamber of Deputies was suborned and decided to impeach Lugo on the 21st of June 2012. The Senate took up the case for impeachment the next day. Proceedings were attended by a delegation of foreign affairs ministers from the other nations of the Union of South American Nations, who concluded that the 2-hour proceeding was a soft coup. Thus ended Lugo's mandate and turned Federico Franco into the new president of Paraguay. The removal of Lugo was followed by demonstrations, of course, by his supporters, but the U.S. had decided to get rid of him, as had the ruling class bosses of Paraguay and the Vatican. So the presidents of Paraguay's neighboring countries, having rejected Lugo's removal from office, compared it to a coup d'etat. Then Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff proposed suspending Paraguay's membership in Mercosur and the Union of South American Nations. Cristina Fernandez Kirchner of Argentina, Rafael Correa of Ecuador, and Leonel Fernandez of the Dominican Republic announced that they would not recognize Franco as president, and condemnation also came from the conservative governments of Colombia and Chile. Lugo's removal was directed by the CIA and supported by the U.S. State Department, Hillary Clinton, as had been Honduras's ouster of Manuel Zelaya in 2009. However, it was denounced as a coup across the Latin American political spectrum. Lugo denounced the impeachment as a congressional coup. The coupists appointed Horacio Cartes in 2013 as their president. The gringo regime in Washington took it in the ass, as they say, but who could they really blame other than themselves? The locals have jumped the gun, as they gave away the CIA plan for bigger game in the gringo strategy of soft coups in Venezuela, Brazil, and Argentina. And the fascist regime in Gringolandia was not happy that they had lost control of their own men, but after all, they did it themselves. And even their own embassy they'd lost control of. And again, they had no one to blame but themselves. Now, today, there's no one in Latin America that thinks that anything that's going on in Argentina, Brazil, or Venezuela is the product of anything other than CIA intervention. Now, we're going to see in the next few months how this thing plays out. But at any rate, that concludes our lecture on Paraguay. And I'm going to move on next to socialism with Chinese characteristics. And we're going to take a look at how China has developed after the death of Mao and the transition to Deng Xiaoping.